Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am, with unwavering devotion to the cause of great conversation, your faithful friend and host, Daniel Finneran. I'm so grateful that you've decided to join me on my modest little channel, on which I think you'll soon discover the internet's best and profoundest conversations are furtively being held. If, like me, you find these conversations engrossing, stimulating, enlightening, or just enjoyable, please do consider subscribing to this channel and becoming a member of our growing community, um, in which you'll play a very important part. Today's conversation is one to which, since first we made contact a few weeks ago, I've been eagerly looking forward. My guest is the esteemed Svetlana Slapšak, a woman of boundless courage, indomitable strength, and prodigious intellect, by whose mere presence on this channel, I must say, I'm very deeply honored. Any attempt of mine to list all of Svetlana's accomplishments would be futile. A brief biological sketch will, for now, suffice, upon which we'll doubtless enlarge in the dialogue to come. Svetlana was born in the year 1948 in Belgrade, Serbia. Now retired, she was a professor of anthropology, philology, Balkanology, and gender studies. She was editor-in-chief of Pro Femina, a quarterly for women's studies and cultural issues, to which many people subscribed. Since 1968, she has been active in fighting for human rights and the freedom of speech, causes for which, so long as the flames of justice and liberty flicker in the human heart, will always be fighting. To list the innumerable countries and universities at which she's lectured would, I fear, strain your patience, dear listener and friend. And so with that, I'd like to extend my warmest welcome to you, Svetlana, and to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
So I want to begin with your birth and your childhood. Now, the state of Slovenia, in which you spent much of your career and presently reside, was created in the year 1945, the very same year in which World War II came to its end. It didn't yet enjoy the status of an independent nation, for which it would have to wait another half century or so, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, of which Yugoslavia was a part. 3 years after Slovenia's founding, in 1948, you were born. You took your place on this wondrous stage of existence at a time of unprecedented upheaval and change. So can you describe to us what it was like to grow up in this age and in this environment?
Well, I was born in Belgrade, so I'm not a Slovenian, as many nationalists here would like to underline. I'm a foreigner here in Slovenia. But when I was born in Belgrade, it was a really turbulent year, very, very much for many people. Some of them I knew, and I found out their stories much later. At the time when I was born, my father's friend gave me the name Svetlana, which is the name of Stalin's daughter. And I was in fashion for 6 months, because in June the same year, Yugoslavia cut off her link to Stalin and became a totally independent country. It was a dangerous time. Soviet troops were on Yugoslav borders, and at the same time, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was executing rather massive picking up of people who were considered dangerous or sympathizers of the Soviets. So many people went to jail and then to isolated island in the Adriatic Sea. It was a turmoil, really a real turmoil. And the guy who gave me the name also went to the jail and then to the island because he was a Soviet sympathizer. Many years later, we discovered all that. So I came out of fashion when it comes to my name, but the youth in the socialist Yugoslavia, in its main city, which is Belgrade, was rather interesting. First of all, I was born into a poor family. And when I was 4, my mother and my father divorced. This was the time when post-traumatic syndrome was not known, and my father was obviously suffering from it. He spent 4 years in concentration camps in Germany, Poland, France, Ukraine, many places. He was an officer, and he tried to escape several times. So he came back with many traumas, and it just couldn't last. Anyway, I was growing up in a family of 3 women: my grandmother, my mother, and me. It was a female family, and in which my grandmother was father. She was severe and precise, and my mother was kind of fluttering around. And myself, I was the happiest child in the world because my mom was working in a publishing house for children's book. And first I would hear all the books when my mom was working on lecturing during the night with her friend, and then I would get the book. So I was listening to the book and then reading books, and books simply defined my childhood. So I didn't feel much being poor and not having possibilities, because there were possibilities. There was this health protection and schooling system. And when I finished with my primary school, the teacher sent me to the classical gymnasium or high school, where I spent 8 years. And well, that's the place where I met some of the elite, children from the elite of Belgrade. But there was no much difference. I was there because I came there without problem. And it was a great time because there was no ideology at all, would you believe, at my time. In fact, we were quite spared from any impact of ideology when we were kids. We had, for some curious reason, we had for free all the Disney products. So cartoons and comics and everything. That was my education. I loved it. Everybody loved it. There is a story that Disney was friendly with Tito for some reason. But anyway, it was really good because we were totally spared of any impact of the Communist Party, except for the last year of my schooling when I was 18. And then there was this person who came to the high school and invited all the pupils to enlist in the Communist Party. And there was one remark, that was me, of course, and I said, we are too young to join the party. And the consequence was that all of my colleagues entered the party except me. I was not accepted. So that was good. I never entered the Communist Party. I was free from that. And I didn't consider it any problem at all. And my family, my 2 women, my grandmother and my mom, were Yugoslavs, by definition, non-ideological at all. And my grandmother came with my mom, came to Belgrade in May 41, after the attack of Germans to Yugoslavia. Her husband in the city of Osijek, which is today in Croatia. There were Serbs from Croatia. So they came to Belgrade because the German soldiers saved them from the Ustashi, from the Croatian nationalists. But unfortunately, my grandfather was tortured for a long time and then publicly executed in Osijek. And my grandmother had a very specific commentary on that. All the men are fools, and all the war are fools, and what the men like mostly are the wars. So get away from men and get away from wars. That was her. She was a kind of spontaneous feminist. She had a very precise idea of women's freedom and emancipation and so on. And the new ideology, the socialist ideology, was based on that. So if you think of the largest group that accepted socialism in Yugoslavia, and especially socialism after the breakup with Stalin, it was women who got voting possibility, free education, free health protection, abortion, divorce, everything was available for women. And of course, possibility of career, equal payment, 1 to 2 years, or sometimes even 3 years of postpartum free time, stuff like that. So when Yugoslavia collapsed and some American feminists came to teach us about women's rights, it was funny. They had like 3 weeks of free time after birth. And we had 4 years if we wanted, paid. So there were some misunderstanding, lots of it. Anyway, my youth was, I would say, happy. And we went to the sea in summer, and even in the 70s, 60s, 70s, my stepfather, my mother remarried when I was 8. She asked me if I would allow it. I said, okay. So she remarried. And I had a stepfather who was a film producer. He was never employed, but worked from film to film. And so in the early youth, I was looking at shooting of great co-production spectacles, like Jean Marais jumping from one horse to another. He never had a replacement. He was doing all by himself, and stuff like that. I was very familiar with the film production, with the comics, and with the cheap novels. That was the taste of my stepfathers. So we shared our love to detective stuff, science fiction, and even Western novels. Okay, but that was aside. That was kind of sport. So that my stepfather and my mom managed to build a little house on the Adriatic coast, and we were going there for 33 years. And in fact, when they when they retired, they spent most of the time there. It was a lovely place. It was a lovely life, modest but absolutely charming. And at the beginning of the war, of course, the locals made clear to my mom that she's not desired anymore. So she left the house, and we never saw it again. The fact is that exactly 50 years after she was threatened by death in Osijek, she was again threatened to be killed in Croatia, in this little place on Adriatic Sea. But never, absolutely never, my mother or my grandmother would say anything against the Croats. They thought that it was about fools who won the war and nothing else. It's not national at all. And even later, the rest of my life, of her life, my mom was always wanting to go to Croatia. She loved Croatia. I love Croatia. I have no problems at all. So it was a very specific kind of living, as you see. In the 68, right from the classical high school, I went to the revolution. I didn't know anything. I was a complete gaga about Marxism. That's the difference which was made between my colleagues and myself. And I founded a group of 3, my 2 colleagues and me, and we declared ourselves Platonists in the middle of Marxist crazy of young revolutionaries.
So you declared yourself Platonists in a sea of Marxists, is that correct?
Yes. we were mostly almost beaten several times for that in the
I would beaten might be the most gentle treatment you could hope to receive.
But we had fun, and in fact, we managed to make a students' periodical, which was called Frontisterion in modern Greek, and in ancient Greek, it means the place for thinking. And it's motive from Aristophanes' Clouds. There's a basket in which Socrates hangs from the ceiling and thinks in this basket. That's from his days. So we were great fun, and we used ancient names for Tito, for Party, so on. The periodical was banned in the print, but we managed to steal several issues. And then, of course, there was a trial in Belgrade against the student leaders who were from faculty of the School of Philosophy, my school. I was studying classical studies, of course, what else, ancient studies. And I should appear as a witness. And I came to the judge, and he was questioning me as a preparation for the trial. And it lasted for some 12 hours. The judge at the end was totally down. I was in a very good mood. And the lawyer was looking at the whole scene. And I think that was one of my best lectures in my whole life. I was proving with philological arguments that what we wrote down was not Tito, in fact, but somebody else. I mean, I was really making fun of the court.
So and you were about how old at this time?
Well, I was 20. No, 22. Sorry, no, 21. 21. Okay, I was 21. So I was finally accepted by the Marxist wing, but with all my faults, ideological mistakes, but I wasn't accepted to be presented at the court as a witness because I was too risky. I could make a public laugh or something else, so they didn't even invite me. So I managed to go along, but then a year later, when I organized a strike at the School of Philosophy, I was beaten by the secret police in the night when I was coming home. They broke my arcade. I still have the scar, and so on. And of course, my academic career was finished, and I knew it. I was the best student of the Belgrade University in 71, but my career was finished. I couldn't aspire for a place at the university. So I went to an institute for literature, which was a kind of reservoir for fallen intellectuals who would not suit the communist standards. So,
did you consider at this time abandoning Eastern Europe entirely and going to the West?
Oh, definitely, but I didn't have a passport. They took away my passport in 68, and I got it once in 73, and then it was taken away from me in 75, and then I was traveling, and it was taken from me once again in 88. So unfortunately, most of my friends could not do the Afghanistan travel and the rest, or flee to the United States and look for the academic career. Nothing of that.
I just want to interrupt briefly because there is. And now I opened the floor to your recounting of your history. And there's so much in that history. I don't think you even realize just how striking some parts of your biography are. First, I just want to return back to what you said about your name. Now, we shouldn't take that lightly. The fact that you were named for Stalin's daughter, of whom history really has no serious record. It's really interesting. I was recently reading a book by Milan Kundera, the Unbearable Lightness of Being, and Kundera, he's an interesting writer, and he takes a lot of deviations into different ideas, political and social and romantic. And at one point, he talks about Stalin, and he talks about specifically Stalin's son. Now, I didn't do any research into Stalin's son, but it struck me because you think of these these dictators, these despots, these almost inhumane men, and they seem almost almost incapable of the ordinary functions of man, which is to reproduce themselves and create a progeny. You know, once I realized that Stalin had a son, it sort of humanizes him a little bit more, and that's a strange feeling. But Kundra talks about Stalin's son and the fact that he was this sort of intermediate figure between the very lowest of the low, because he was basically abandoned by Stalin and also had some claim to a kind of royalty, a Marxist royalty in the Soviet Union. And I think ultimately, as Kundra describes it, he dies in a German concentration camp in his attempt to escape through the electrified barbed wire. So I'm just sort of tossed head over heels now that you mentioned the fact that your name is sort of an homage to Stalin's daughter, of whom I had no awareness. And with my recent readings of Kundra, it really kind of creates an interesting link between the two. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, and then beyond that, you can comment on that if you desire.
Yeah,
but
I'd love to.
Yeah, but then after that, I want to know if your situation in which your grandmother and your mother and you yourself were living together, if that was somewhat common in the post-war era. I would assume, because of the massive casualties suffered not only by civilians, but of course the conscripted men, both in the Soviet Union and in Germany and in all of Europe, probably left a lot of families shattered. The fact that your father, your biological father, survived 4 concentration camps.
No, more than that.
More than that. Sure. In multiple countries is astonishing. But I would assume, I know based on the figures, that many men, if we could count him lucky, and I probably he would not count himself that lucky, but many men perished and left families kind of devoid of that paternal figure. So I want you maybe to comment just briefly on the relationship of Stalin's daughter and you and your name, and the fact that you were sort of this apostate from Marxism. I wonder if your apostasy was I don't know, somewhat predetermined. The fact that you were named and you didn't choose this name and it was sort of thrust upon you, and your later resistance to the Stalin ideology. I wonder if there's something in that. And then maybe you can comment on the general phenomenon of these sort of matriarchal-led families out of necessity because of the loss of so much life.
Well, it's linked to my father and to his character. Yes, he was an officer. He had this career in front of him, and then it was cut down by the war. And he was liberated by Russians. And then he decided to go with the Russian army ahead to Berlin. He wanted to destroy Berlin. That was his plan. But then he came with the Soviet army. He came to the Polish city, which is at the frontier with Germany, close to the frontier. That's Bydgoszcz. And he saw it was just freed from Germans, and he saw a mountain of dead bodies of Germans on the shore of the river which runs through Bydgoszcz. And he had a kind of total transformation. He said, I had enough. And he came back home. Otherwise, he would go to Berlin. But he came back home. And he was a hard-headed person. When he came back home, he took again the officer's position, and then he remarked that soldiers in the barracks have weaker meals than the officers, and he protested. Of course, he lost his position immediately. So he was out of the game when this breaking up with Stalin came, and he could not be blamed for anything. He was out already. So it was, in a way, it saved him. So I inherited some of his mental constructed, this hard-headed orientation and so on. And I wasn't deprivileged because my name was Svetlana, not at all. That was okay. But my mom and my grandmother, when they heard that my name would be Svetlana, they went to the church and christened me and gave me a Christian name of Natalia, which I never used. So just in case mom and grandmother did their own thing, just in case the situation changes, I have another name to use. Okay, so that's this story.
And let me ask you, were your mother and grandmother very religious? Do you remember them
no,
there
not
being
at
so?
all. Absolutely not. My grandmother was a real natural atheist. She hated priests. She she would give me an advice when we went to the market on Sunday morning. We would go to the market to shop, and she would tell me, if you see a priest, you say, I kiss your hand, but you never kiss his hand. It's not hygienic.
Oh goodness.
She was horrible. My grandma, pity she wasn't born into the time of French encyclopedia in the 18th century. She would be perfect. Anyway,
Yeah,
uh,
she would be side by side with Voltaire and Diderot.
absolutely,
Um,
absolutely, and
so
also
she sounds like a remarkable figure, just
absolutely.
as all of your family members are. But do you think that your grandmother had the largest influence on you and your thinking as a child?
Oh, we were quarreling all the time, but she had this influence. I became feminist very early without realizing it, so I was there already. And my mom was a much lighter character, and in her old age, she started imagining that she was religious. So we were making fun of her, but she was going to the church sometimes, and she had some feelings. But okay, we don't hate her for that. On the contrary, anyway, religion was not an item. Communism was not an item, although both of my female family members were really up to and ready to voluntary work. And I remember my grandmother with a gas mask going to the courses to teach women about all kinds of things, especially to make them write and read. And also, when I was very young, I didn't understand clearly, but then later I understood. From time to time, a young woman from the villages around Osijek or Slavonia generally would come to our place and stay for a day or two, and then they would come back with some gifts and so on. My mother would accept young women who came to Belgrade for abortion, and then she would take care of them and write letters to their relatives and parents that she came to visit her and stuff like that, and covering up the whole thing. So she was, in that sense, she was a kind of feminist saint. She was helping all kinds of women which were coming to our home. And also, when I was kind of 4 or 5 years, she told me, "You never repeat what you heard in your at your home, and I will give you the credit of being valuable woman for that." And I was so proud that I really never repeated things I heard at home. And women were coming to her, they were smoking and drinking coffee and discussing all kinds of problems, sexual, familiar problems, kids, and so on and so on. It was
And
a
let me
kind of,
ask, at
yeah,
that time, was the
yeah.
vision of a woman doing those things, drinking coffee and smoking, was that thought to be inappropriate or untraditional?
Oh, not at all. First of all, in the city centers before the war, it was very fashionable, and elite ladies would smoke. That was one of the signs of modernity coming from Hollywood films, of course. And on the other hand, traditionally in the Balkans, women, yes, sit together, they smoke and they drink coffee even today in Bosnia.
Hmm.
That's the image of an old woman in Bosnia, smoking and drinking coffee.
Yeah, yeah. The image of any cultivated person in Europe or in America. I
Difficult.
have, I have, I have to ask though. It's usually thought that in the absence of religion or belief in a religious doctrine,
Mm-hmm.
communism is supposed to occupy that place. Some might even equate communism to being in some ways religious, and in many ways, I think that association is apt. For instance, instead of the Bible, you have a communist manifesto. Instead of a providence, you have dialectical materialism and the certain march of history. Instead of God, you have a Zeus-looking Karl Marx, I think, who actually modeled himself off of images of busts of
No, he
Jupiter.
didn't. Everybody look like that. Everybody was
So,
awesome.
so, but you describe your family as both rejecting traditional religion, let's call it Christian religion. I would assume maybe Eastern Orthodox or even
Yeah, of
Catholic,
course, Eastern Orthodox.
Eastern
Yes,
Orthodox.
Christian as
But
Eastern
then,
Orthodox.
yeah, but then also rejecting that by which religion was ideologically supposed to be replaced,
Yeah.
which was the communism. So kind of where were you rooted? Where did you find, or where did your mother and grandmother, where did they find their solidity, I would say, maybe in the world of morals or in ethics? Where were they finding this?
In themselves, really, in the life, as they would name it. They were totally in the belief that life is worth fighting for, that love is worth fighting for, but a decent love, the real love, stuff like that. So they were, yes, ethically. If you want to define it, it's difficult. But I would.
Now, I'm going to
blame.
interrupt. I'm going to interrupt. I apologize for my
Yeah,
having
yeah,
not
yeah,
some,
yeah.
but as a very precocious
Uh-huh.
girl, as you were, did you feel like that was intellectually satisfactory to claim, as your mother or grandmother did, that love is worth fighting for? Well, that's fine. It's a noble sentiment, um, and one with which I resonate. But did you feel like there has to be something beneath that? I need to explore that a little bit. And maybe you found that in the classics. Maybe you found that in Platonic theory or Aristotelian virtue. But did ever that it occur to you that maybe that there's something insipid about that espousal of those beliefs?
Well, of course, but I was in the books from my early youth. So I knew that my mom and my grandmom were, in fact, cuddly and fluffy and loving and warm. And that was enough. I didn't ask for more. I had my world in the books. And very curious choice of books, but my mother insisted that I read Anglo-Saxon children's literature. She thought that that was the most appropriate for a young girl. So I was marked from the early age by Winnie the Pooh and Alice in Wonderland, and that's my literature even today. When I feel depressed, I go to Winnie the Pooh and found my true ground there, philosophical ground.
There is great sage-like wisdom in Mr. Pooh. I
Absolutely,
think
there were
that
excellent
should
books
not
like
be overlooked.
the Tao of Pooh and different books.
Yes, the Tao of Pooh.
And also the collections of books and so on. And then when I grew up a little bit, I was totally in Shakespeare. I was reading Shakespeare like crazy all the summer of vacations, school vacations, and so on and so on. So I was with my book, and that was my world. And my good relations with mom and grandma was in the fact that they would encourage me to go there, not to stay with them. On the contrary, my grandmother had the idea that I have to study to make my career, and then perhaps if I really want to think about marriage. So, but not necessarily. So that was her idea. And on the other hand, when you mention the communism and the religion, it's an extremely interesting question. Today we live in a world of nationalisms, exclusion, different groups, and the whole unbelievable amount of stupidity. Let's face it, when it comes to define groups and to define human. Communism has one advance, I must say. and that is, you believe in Marx or in manifesto, whatever you want, from the Marxist ideology, because you read something, not because you were born as something, and not that you were born in such a group with such history and so on, and such myths and so on and so on. No, on the contrary, you are qualified to enter the group if you read something. So you have to read and write. This is the basic demand of communism, and it's not bad at all. If we were insisting on reading and writing today, maybe the world would be different. So communism has this advantage of not classifying people by gender, nation, and race. That's really important. And much later, when I started to read this literature, I found out really, especially today, extremely convincing arguments and analysis concerning capitalism. So it's not dead, not at all. The system is dead, but the literature is not. And living in literature, if you want, being in the books from the early youth, I got my myopia from there. I got my ankles, which are hard as dinosaurs, because I was reading, lying on the stomach, and so on and so on. Yes, but these texts remain, and sometimes they are even more important than the knowledge I can get on internet or in the library. Yeah. So there is something about reading and literacy that is so important, and that was the main quality in communism. If you can imagine hundreds of millions of people in Soviet Union, which in fact had a few possibilities to express themselves, and one of the possibilities to express themselves was to read. There was no limit to reading. So reading everything they wanted, reading a huge choice of books, reading and writing as a consequence of that, being capable of writing. Everything else was under censorship, but literature was not. Literature was largely acceptable and largely obtainable. So there are some qualities that definitely formed me as a character.
Yeah, and I agree in the fact that communism does have a few things to recommend it. Now, I'm not claiming myself a communist, but not yet. Maybe at the end of this conversation, my views will have shifted dramatically. I don't suppose that they will, but there are a few things on which I want to focus. The first is the story that communism tells. Now, we as human beings are narrative-seeking species. We need stories. I think it's quite fundamental to our very being. And communism, for all of its shortcomings, perhaps in other areas, does tell a good story. It kind of speaks to a very noble impulse inside of man that might not be recognized in this world, but is certainly one for which and to which men and women can aspire. You also mentioned the fact that it's a highly literate philosophy or economic social theory or what have you, or religion, whatever you want to call it. And I'm reminded of the name by which my own people go, the Jewish people. I consider myself a semi-Semite. And that is the people of the book. So there's an interesting connection there. You talk about communism really appealing to a very literate class or group of people, let's say. Of course, they would disregard the idea of class, but it's almost as though it's a philosophy for people of the book. It is for people of the book, just as Judaism was for the Jews. The Jews were considered the people of the book, a very highly literate group of people. And just a third point, which is the universality toward which communism endeavors. Of course, it never quite achieves that. It seems very hyper nationalized. You think of Cambodian communism and Vietnamese
Yeah,
communism and Chinese communism and Russian communism.
of course. Of
So
course.
yeah, it's supposed to collapse those distinctions of nation,
Mhm.
region,
Oh, yes,
but it
definitely.
never quite does. And of course, it tends toward the reduction of a society into a very thin top level of elites,
Mhm.
right? The vanguard,
Of course.
who are merely supposed to bring forth the revolution so that all classes and all government can then wither away, and of course the immiserated masses. And it always seems to be stuck at that point, and they never quite get beyond that, where you have that upper elite and the impoverished masses below them. Um, that's a lot there that I just blurted out, but those are just some of my thoughts that I conjured up as you were talking. Maybe I'll ask you one thing that's a little bit firmer,
Mhm.
and that is to give me your thoughts about the importance of women in burgeoning philosophico-religious movements. You talked about women having a very important role to play in the early years of of um, the socialistic movements across Eastern Europe, right? Or at least in Serbia,
Oh, in Yugoslavia, you mean?
or in Yugoslavia. I'm sorry,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but again, I draw another
Uh-huh.
connection back to the Judeo-Christian religion and that tradition.
Mhm.
And in the
Mhm.
early ages of Christianity, well, by whom was the religion most successfully and indefatigably forwarded? And in many cases, that was women. Women
Mhm.
were instrumental in spreading
Mhm.
the faith throughout the Roman Empire, and making it the dominant religion of all of Europe, still as it is today, in a smaller extent, but still. So, why is it that women specifically have this natural aptitude at promulgating these very powerful ideas and
Yeah.
bringing them to their fuller fruition?
Well, it's not natural. It's culture. Women in patriarchy, which is the ruling system even today, and it lasts some 10,000 years at least, maybe a little more. Um, they were responsible for caring about everything that is not movable for the moment, and that is small children, old people, and themselves. The heroes were always somewhere away. So they were responsible for narrative, for education, for literacy sometimes in some societies, some higher societies. They were the bearers of narratives. So when Christianity came with its really unbelievable twist in communication from the ancient world, which is the possibility of praying without voice. That's the basic thing. Praying without voice. Everything in antiquity was vocal. You had to say. Uh, when you communicate with gods, you speak to them. You speak when you read, and you speak all the time. But with Christianity, there comes the possibility that you communicate with your God without speaking in yourself. Well, that is a typical women's position. So of course they took it on. Of course they changed the world with that. Of course they were crucial in transferring Christianity and familiarizing with it. Um, but there's another element too, and that is that Christianity, in a very pragmatic social sense, gave women more rights and more presentation and more presence. Which of course is disputed. We know that, in fact, poor Mary caused much of trouble between Catholicism and Orthodoxy and so on. It's not her fault. But there is this line in which gender really clashes with Christianity. and the damage is still visible, unfortunately. So yes, women got something, introduced something, transferred something, and then lost it, which is a typical moment of women's history generally. They conquer something, they have something, they have a value, and then it's taken from them. But let me go to a detail that is very characteristic for my youth and my family, and that is this deep sympathy with Jews. First of all, Serbs and Jews and Roma were at the same position at the beginning of the war. My grandmother had her best friend, and it was a Jewish lady who was living with them in Osijek, while my grandfather was building the home for this woman, which was called Fanny. And Fanny was her best friend, and it was a woman from her she learned how to be a lady, how to wear, how to make up, how to behave, everything. So she adored her. And when they moved to Zagreb, this Jewish family remained. In fact, our family, my mother and I and myself, went to Zagreb to visit our Jewish family. So it was a very, very intimate link. And also the best friend of my mother was a Jewish woman. And I adored her. It was, for me, it was another role model, I must say. She was very cool, very rational, very precise, very cynical. She was a real model of an independent woman who didn't want to move with her husband to Israel, but remain in Yugoslavia with her daughter. She never married. And she was a partisan during the war. That's how she survived. She was in the partisan guerrilla army. She fought, and the rest of 28 Jewish girls who were in the same classroom with my mom were killed in Jasenovac or in Auschwitz. So this love, this relation with Jewish people was really deep. And at the end of her life, my grandmother, without us knowing it, went to the Rabbi of Belgrade and asked if she could be transferred into the Jewish religion. And he answered, that's a bit too late, and we don't do that, and so on and so on. Well, the real patriarchal answer. So she didn't become a Jew, but that was her wish at the end of the life. She felt close only to the Jewish religion. That's something that expressed her. I don't know why. So that's an element which really explains so many things for me. This love for Jews is still on. I still have a contact with the daughter of my mother's friend. My mother and her friend are dead now, and so on. We still have connections. We still think of each other. So it's a phenomenon which was, of course, caused by the context, but there's something else in it, something deeper.
Yeah, something extraordinarily deep.
Mm-hmm.
So many directions in which we could go. Maybe just because you mentioned the Lysistrata and Aristophanes a little while ago, and we're talking about the role of women in the earliest years after the death of Jesus. Maybe you could explain for us what sexual politics might have been like in the classical world. So, of course, when we think of the great dramatists of Athens, we think of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. But I think the best treatment of the actual world in which these 5th and 4th century men lived and the broader population lived is to be found in Aristophanes.
Definitely.
Yeah, always
agree.
Leave it to the comedians to really illustrate exactly how life is being lived in all of its glories and all of its blemishes. So, his work, his great work, the Lysistrata, might be the best example, during which, as I remember, the women withhold sex from the men until the conclusion of their hostilities, their wars. And it reminds me of what your grandmother said. The two banes of existence are men and war, right? So it almost sounds like if she wasn't classically read, she was Aristophanic in her understanding of the world and its problems. But maybe you can put on your classicist hat and describe for us a little bit about how the sexual politics and relations worked in Athens, let's say, which we consider to be the height of Western civilization. Perhaps it wasn't so high for women. And maybe contrast that with another prominent city-state like Sparta, where generally women are considered to have been a little bit freer in some senses because of the demands placed on the militaristic men who are always sort of training for their upcoming battles and preparing to check the helots at every possible point and ensure that there was no uprising. So maybe you can describe that situation and relationship a little bit.
Well, there are so many books, and my preferred is Eva Coyle's The Reign of Pallas, which I reread again and again. But I don't share all of her views on Aristophanes. Aristophanes obviously was an intellectual in the sense that he was the member of the club of intellectuals, which would meet every day, absolutely, in the democratic institutions of Athens, and of course at the Agora. And they would shut themselves out and discuss the issues. And one of the issues was definitely the position of women. The position of women was important because, first of all, men were so privileged that they had liberty to discuss it. And the other thing is that there was a social situation in which obviously women felt differently about the war, although they didn't have any possible means to say it publicly. And we also should think about the fact that the theater was a democratic institution. It was not culture. It was part of democracy. And all the Athenian citizens were present at the plays, at the performances, and in fact, theater discussed in the theater topics which were not to be found in trials, in Agora, and everywhere else in the people's parliament, and so on and so on. But only in theater, and that is private life, relation to the past, relation to gods, and so on and so on. So what Aristophanes does, and the comedy is basically older than the tragedy. It's based on rituals which can be found almost everywhere in the world, even today. Comedy was showing, the aim of comedy was showing people, showing citizens, the world as a glove which you turned upside down. So you see all the stitches and all the elements of structure, and you can laugh at them because the first face is elegant and important, and the other face is laughable. So what he wanted to say is that the world can be turned upside down, as in carnival. Of course, the whole thing is about carnival and about masks and about presenting someone else and being in different states too, by wine and so on and so on. So these comedies, in fact, show the possibilities of democracy, and they're represented as crazy, and they do function as crazy, but in fact they propose very precise and rational solutions. And in this sense, Lysistrata, of course, is absolutely one of the funniest. But there's another comedy which is much clearer in this political sense. That's Women in the Popular Parliament, in the People's Parliament, in which women...
What is the Greek title of that? I can never pronounce it.
Ekklesiazosei.
Yeah. I never even I never even venture its pronunciation for fear of failing.
Ecclesia is people's parliament, in which everybody has a voice and a presence if he wants, and all of them want, all of male citizens want. So women prepare to take power, but not by revolution or by sexual strike, like in Lysistrata, but by making men vote them to take power. So they learn male rhetoric, which they have at home anyway. Their husbands blabber about it all the time when they come back home. So they learn these tricks and rhetorics, And then they mask themselves as young, attractive men. And the effect in the parliament is double. One is they speak in a very conservative way. They are young and they are erotically attractive. So this is the young conservative guys are absolutely favorite even today in all the parliaments. So then, in fact, yes, they do vote that the power passes to women. And they come home and inform their women who were already back that they took the power. And there's an episode which explains everything. Of course, women introduce something that is absolutely similar to communism. Sorry. It is a communism. It is the equal division and distribution of goods, of food, of everything else, and kids are educated by everybody, and so on and so on. This is the critics' feeble point. Most of the critics really fell intellectually at this point, and this is the moment in which there is a question of right to sex by older women. No classicist has endured this exam. And there's this absolutely immortal scene in which the new law is applied, and the new law says that every woman who is older has the primary right to have sex with a young man.
Yes.
There's a young man coming to the window of his beloved. And suddenly an older woman appears and says, no, I have more rights. And then another, even more disfigured and older, says, no, it's my right. And then the third one, and then the fourth one, and they bring away the poor guy.
And of course, he's resisting the entire way and expostulating that he shouldn't have to undergo this mishandling.
So many classicists were scandalized by this scene, and the list of them is absolutely hilarious. They couldn't bear the idea that something like that happens. Anyway, the whole thing about the ecclesiastics is that all the laws, in fact, are applied. Everybody's happy, and of course, they have a huge orgy at the end. That's the usual ending of Aristophanes' comedies. But the whole idea of provoking people so much, of provoking a male audience, which is exclusively male, so much, of course, women are played by young men, by young attractive men on the scene. So much provocation, so much, if you want, extreme radical thinking on the scene, that in fact representation and reception of Aristophanes in the Western culture is really meager. People didn't.
Yeah, and I think underemphasized. And I think underemphasized. I think
yeah, absolutely.
The tradition of Aristophanes, I think, is weaker than that of some of the other great dramatic tragedians. And of course, that's assuming that we even still read these great artists of the past. And I think increasingly they're less read, which probably is sad for someone like you who cherishes these things and has spent an academic lifetime reading and rereading them because of their bountiful wisdom and beauty. Do you think that during that time, do you think that Aristophanes better captured and reflected the mores of Athenian Greek life than did some of his dramatic counterparts, such as Euripides and Sophocles, who are a little bit more serious, maybe a little bit more conservative in their views?
No. I don't think so at all. Sophocles is a great fighter for democracy, for me. Maybe this is a lonely statement, but when you read Antigone, which is overread over the centuries, it is a story about a young woman who cannot reach the right she thinks she could, because she cannot approach any of the institutions which could change the law. She's completely out, being a woman. And her fiancé, Haimon, is so shocked by the fact that he cannot help her in her political ambition, in her political strive, kills himself. That's a very strange situation in the Greek tragedy, that the guy is committing a suicide for such reason. But then you think about Sophocles presenting this tragedy to Athenians by the trick saying, well, this is in Thebes. So you can imagine it. But in
And
fact,
can you just momentarily explain to us why Thebes is important? It seems like in a lot of Greek mythology, let's call it, or dramatic presentation, Thebes is used, right? We have, in the Oedipus mythology. Why Thebes?
it's extremely important because culturally, from the prehistory on, it has technological links and parallels with other Mediterranean states and technologies like the Egyptian one. It has this unbelievably rich mythology, Boeotia as a whole, not only Thebes. And for Athenians, Thebes were kind of, yes, they were conflictual, but on the other hand, they didn't have democracy. They had kings and tyrants, and they didn't have democracy. So whatever you wanted to say, you could say it through Thebes. Whatever you wanted to say to Athenians made them think about their own democracy, their own system, was even more picturesque if you use Thebes. So it was one of the strategies, dramatic strategies of many writers to do that. Of course, Euripides is something completely different. He goes into different parts of the world, but Sophocles is very typical in insisting on the Theban cycle and representing the whole possibilities of monarchy and the transition from tyranny to democracy. That's something that was very, very educational for the Athenians. So
and it served as something of a trope. It would be like today, you would, in a spirit of regional pride, right? I'm in Florida, so you might speak disparagingly of New York, for instance, and you might talk about the way in which New Yorkers live and the way they, prepare their meals or what have you, as opposed to the superior Floridian style, or choose your state, or vice versa. New Yorkers would probably say the very same about Floridians, and I'm sure in Europe it's still similar. So yeah, Thebes was that trope. It was used as a sort of a contrast to describe maybe a culturally somewhat inferior place.
Of course. The Boeotians are considered less intelligent and so stuff like that. So yes, stereotypes are there; they're playing their role. But in Lysistrata, there's a moment which really destroys even some of the stereotypes. Spartan women come to Athenian women and they concur to organize the sexual strike together. So yes, the Spartan woman comes in her miniskirt, and she's athletic, and the Athenian women admire her for her body beauty and strength, but they have the same ideas. So there's no problem in communicating. On the contrary, politically, they can do together so many things. You never forget that Aristophanes was already exposed to inimical actions between Athenians and Spartans, and Euripides even more. And Euripides does not care about democracy so much, but he cares about women. And if Aristophanes can sound conservative and feminist at the same time, Euripides is even crazier. He is misogynist and feminist at the same time.
Yeah, probably the reason he's the subject of Nietzsche's scorn in his book, The Birth of Tragedy. And yeah, of course, and he was a great admirer. He was a great admirer of Aeschylus. But yeah, so maybe just maybe not too academic a tone. Can you talk a little bit about Euripides and that strange tension between the misogynistic and the feminist?
Yes, he, as I said, he doesn't care so much about democracy. But when you read Medea, and you wonder at this mixture of very mythical narratives and solutions, and on the other hand, the psychologically minutious dialogue between Medea and her husband, and the reason for divorce, and the reason for marriage, and the relation between men and women, and so on. This is absolutely up to date. But on the other hand, this other part, and that is the total absence of culpability for Medea. for killing her children, because she killed her sons, to destroy Jason's masculinity, his authority in the world, his masculine authority in the world. And when you think about this, yes, well, this was written for another generation, not for us, not even for us, but for maybe for year 3000, if we're still alive. If humans are alive, maybe they will understand Medea. So other plays are always based, Euripides' plays are always based on a conflict of two persons, two characters, in a social situation which is recognizable, which is standard situation, lovers, mother and daughter, father and son, and so on and so on. You really analyze the situations which are so applicable today, which are so clear today, which you understand clearly. And you have to think about the context and the democracy when reading Sophocles, because you don't understand so clearly. So Euripides is something very universal for our time, which was not the situation, let's say, in the 18th century or in even before. But today he's unbelievably actual.
Yeah, and I agree. And among the three tragedians, I would say Euripides is probably my favorite. And of course, I highly regard Nietzsche. And when Nietzsche speaks so contemptuously of him, I feel like I need to reassess that affection that I hold for him. But still, I think you're right. I think Euripides, perhaps because he brought in a new angle. I think he brought forth another actor onto the stage and really expanded the scope of the dramatic world, constrained though it still was, but still broadened it significantly, and I think is the bridge that connects the classical world of drama to the present one. I recently read a book by Natalie Haynes. She's a British author and comedian of whom I'm a big fan, and the title of her book was Pandora's Jar. Of course, she uses the proper etymological word instead of the box which we associate Pandora. She refers to it in her title very shrewdly as a jar. And she lists all the secondary female figures in Greek mythology, let's say, like the femme fatales like Medea and Clytemnestra, or the incomparable beauties like Helen or Penelope with her unwavering patience. So tell me, shifting from the playwrights to the women about whom they wrote, who is your favorite female character in Greek myth?
I adore Penelope because she is a detective. She is a wise woman who knows how to cheat, and she's cheating obviously in front of all the world and the suitors, because she's beweaving what she has been weaving during day. And she says it's a cover for Ulysses' father when he dies. But you don't bury people in wool. Wool is half alive, half dead. And in Jewish tradition, there's only linen, which can be used for dead people. So she's fooling everybody openly.
So
these idiots do not know the rituals.
It's deceitful on multiple levels. And I believe when she begins the burial shroud, her father-in-law isn't yet dead.
No, he's not. He's well alive, and he's alive when Odysseus came back. And the other thing is, when Odysseus finally comes back 20 years later, she wants to ask him all the impossible questions to check his identity. Everybody else knows he's Odysseus. He has proven that he's Odysseus. Not her. So she asks him 1,000 questions, and among them, of course, the most important question, which only 2 of them know. So she is sure that he is Odysseus, not someone else. So it's such a cool mind, such an organized mind, who also lets her son Telemachus to behave like a patriarchal man. And she taught him to be that. But then when he says, mother, the place for women is in the back room and so on and blah blah. She doesn't criticize him. She said, "Okay." I suppose she said, "My job has been done. I made the man out of you," and so on. So she's both cynical, both rational, both a woman in serious age, in love. Everything is there. She's really wonderful, absolutely wonderful person. And what I like especially is that early presentation of a love affair which lasts for years, a marriage, which is, well, it's possible, even if he flandered around for 20 years and slept with goddesses and sirens, and who knows what.
Not always under his own volition. He was sometimes enchanted,
Yeah.
which would, I don't think, be a serviceable excuse for any of you husbands out there listening.
And the other person I like very much is Praxagora from Women in the Parliament, Ecclesiazus, and she is a teacher of women who are preparing for their presentation in the Parliament. And she, of course, teaches them how to behave, not to mention female goddesses, not to mention anything from the women's world, and so on and so on. So she's really a great activist, feminist activist, and I love her. But there are also many other women that I like. I like Helen very much because she's so unbelievably immoral.
The face that launched 1,000 ships. So tell us why. We, sort of have a little bit of ambivalence. We look back with an ambivalent eye toward Helen, right?
Yeah.
She was. I think we failed to appreciate some of those virtues that you just explained. And if you read Homer, she's not at all depicted as being an unvirtuous person, sort of a victim to fate, really, above all. So why do you like Helen?
I like Helen because she's so demanding, and at the same time, she's a very wise woman. She's capable of seducing her husband after 10 years of infidelity with Paris and his brother after Paris, and so on and so on. Just by showing off her breast, that's enough for her husband.
That's enough for most men.
And what I really like is the scene in Odyssey in which Telemachus comes to Sparta and he meets Helen, and Helen is the wittiest, the warmest, the most elegant hostess that you can imagine. She knows how to behave. So I really love her for that. She can really play men on all the angles, sex, beauty, and behavior, and her social graces and so on. I really love her for that.
And I want you to comment briefly on her half-sister, Clytemnestra.
Mm-hmm. Well, Clytemnestra is deprivileged by being mortal. Helen, in fact, is supposed to be immortal. Well, she dies, but then there are so many versions of her death and of her being, in fact, a tree, a symbol of fertility and so on. But Clytemnestra, on the other hand, is a very honest woman. And what she does is to make revenge on Agamemnon for many crimes he did. And many crimes are first killing her first husband, and then, of course, being responsible for Iphigenia's death. That's the worst. She wanted to be a real wife. She wanted to be normal, let's say. But when the father decides to sacrifice his own daughter, she turns into a avenger. And the affair with Aegisthus and everything else, and the killing of Agamemnon, that's her other part. That's her diabolic part, if you want, which was caused by the men's behavior.
Yeah.
So she is an honest woman who turns bad because immense crimes have been committed against her.
And I think it's that turn that draws my affinity toward her. Between the two, if I had to choose, maybe this says something about my personality and my character, but if I had to choose between Helen and Clytemnestra, just as figures of literature, I'm inclined to choose Clytemnestra. There's something very upstanding, yet also completely depraved about her. And the fact that she is such a defender of her sacrificed daughter.
Yeah,
And
of course.
the husband by whom that unforgivable sin was perpetrated is ennobling in some ways, but then the way in which she goes about securing her revenge,
Mhm.
the
Yes,
slaughter of Cassandra and the slaughter of her husband
yes.
is cripplingly terrifying. um,
Well, yeah.
let me ask you now,
Mhm,
if you could pluck one of these female characters
mhm,
from the Greek myth in which they originally belong, right, in that story, and place them in a Shakespearean story,
mhm,
who would you pluck, and in which Shakespearean tragedy or comedy would you place her?
mhm. I would replace Juliet with Medea.
That's that would be an interesting substitution. How might that story play out?
Uh, Basically, Romeo and Juliet are a wonderful drama, but when you analyze what is the plot and what is the problem there, it's only sex. It's pure sex and nothing else. So, how to avoid bans, how to make sex, how to have sex, and how to end the story when there's no more possibility. That's extremely simple, although they are both very witty and the dialogues are absolutely sublime. But in fact, it's very simple. So if the Romeo, which is a kind of mature guy, he's not a boy, he's an adult without any social responsibility. So if he met me there, that would be a wonderful possibility to make him real man, to make him really suffer, really fight for his love, really lose his social position, and so on and so on. He would not escape, but at the end, he would not wish to escape. But on the contrary, he would like to present himself and Medea as a couple which is uh, ready for the social situation, which is, if you want, valued as a couple. There wouldn't be a secret. He would fight to not to become a secret lover, not at all. So the whole thing would be to for him to well change society, to adapt society to his love and his couple and his affair and so on. So I would love to see that couple.
Have you considered that question before? It sounds as though you were prepared for that.
Yeah, well, not exactly, but I was thinking about a film that really fascinated me. It's a film. Made in '36, and Romeo is played by Leslie Howard, and Julia is played by oh, now it slipped out the name of Norma Shearer, and they're both in their 40s.
I apologize, dear friends and listeners, for that short interruption. It appears that Zeus, king of Olympus, to whom we were inadequately supplicatory, decided to interrupt our chat by throwing down one of his vaunted mighty thunderbolts. He must have been displeased by the profanity I uttered when I spoke of Karl Marx's likeness to the king of Olympian gods. So I wanted to pick up where we left off in our discussion about Shakespeare. Now, Svetlana, you were telling me that if you could pluck and move one character from classical Greek tragedy into the world of Shakespeare, you would have chosen Medea, and you would have placed her into the context of Romeo and Juliet. And I think that choice is absolutely extraordinary and one for which I was not prepared. I think, had I the opportunity and the power to do so, I might have selected. I might have selected maybe Penelope and brought her into the world of Hamlet. I feel as though he could have benefited from someone of as capacious an intellect and as sound a mind as his, perhaps as a compliment to him. Um, But I want to go and ask you about your favorite Shakespearean play.
As you like it.
I'm sorry, what was it?
As you like it. That's the
As You Like It. And for what reason?
for the intelligent woman in it.
Ah, very good. Very good.
I really, really love Rosalind.
I see. I see. And would you say that she is your favorite character in his oeuvre?
Oh, absolutely. And if we do the opposite, I would join her with the Petronius.
Ah, very good. In the opposite direction, of course.
Absolutely.
We have an interesting swapping of characters.
Definitely.
So let me turn now to feminism more generally. Of course, this has sort of been a topic about which we've been speaking for the past hour or so. As we know, that feminism has taken many iterations, many different waves, so to speak. Um, each pursued its respective end, be it suffrage or in employment equality to the accessing of admissions to university or inclusion in sports or in the military. Um, can you maybe explain to us where we are currently and what this more modern wave of feminism hopes to achieve that perhaps wasn't secured by the prior waves out of which it was born?
Well, at this moment, I see feminism as the older sister with all the problems of older sister who has to deal with all the new movements and identities and groups which appeared in the last 50 years, let's say. And she has to be wise, she has to be helpful, and she has to be visible. These are the demands. And on the other hand, I see feminism in social movements today as a huge front which can oppose capitalism, which can really work on well, I wouldn't say destroy capitalism, but at least reduce it to forms which are more humanly acceptable. So that would be feminist role. It's a huge role. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of fight. So modern feminism should not be linked only to questions of gender and genders. Also, would be there to help and help building and help differentiating. But on the other hand, the most of it that you read like that. And to make it, yeah, make it pliable for humans. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Capitalism was not meant to help you.
I
We
see.
have a problem here. So today it turns to be a really, really grotesque and perverse form of social
I see.
making poor and miserable and sick everyone.
I see. And I apologize. I'm not hearing you entirely clearly. so that perhaps could be on my end. It could be what I'm receiving. So I'm trying my best to squint and to strain and to hear as best I can. But so I think I understood in large part what your response to that. But we've seen, especially in the West, and I don't know if it's as prominent an issue where you are in Slovenia and in that part of Europe, but we've seen the rise of a totally new movement, at least so far as we understand it here, and that is of transgenderism. And it seems like, in many ways, that movement is a very serious and existential threat to everything for which a classical feminist fought. We now see the inclusion of biological men who declare themselves to be women to be accepted as such, with very little demands on them to demonstrate their, let's call it their womanhood. So how does, or their professed womanhood, so how does a feminist in the classical sense, such as you, if you would declare yourself to be as that, how do you view this new transgender movement that seems to be overtaking America and maybe the European West more generally?
It is overtaking space globally, and I wouldn't put it as a problem. I think that transgenderism is the future of gender. It is the future in which gender will be available if you want as an idea and as a realization, temporarily, not for the times, not for always. So it is the future in which feminism has to find its role. And I think this is completely realizable, it's feasible, and in fact, it's only to learn more about transgenderism in order to help.
So if I understand you correctly, you said that it is the future. I'm sorry, it's part of some of the difficulty I'm having hearing you.
It is the future of the gender, of genders, the possibility of changing, the possibility of temporarily changing, the possibility of totally changing, radically changing, and these changing sexualities will be the future.
Will be the future. Do you not fear that that future might include basic annihilation of what it means to be a woman?
No, I don't think so. If we have enough liberty and equality, there is no such problem for the future. Enough liberty, enough democracy, enough equality, that's extremely important, and social security. And in this situation, women will be free to be women if they really want, or change to whatever they want.
And how do you think about it in regard to sports, for example? That seems to be one of the great sticking points in American discourse today, public discourse.
I would destroy commercial sports.
You would prefer the sports go away?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, assuming they remain with us, and I think they probably will in America.
The idea is to take everyone.
I thought you might. I thought you might be a champion of sports, being that they have such a strong Greek heritage and they draw their lineage from that.
Well, the Greek sport was political. Let's face it.
Yeah.
It was deeply political, and was based on a completely different set of mind of ancient Greeks. Today, I really hate commercial sports. I hate everything around it, all the disciplines, and I really, truly wish that sports should be available for everybody, and it should be practiced as part of our enjoyment in life.
But not commercialized.
Absolutely.
Just for the pure enjoyment of them.
And health, of course, and health.
Huh. Why? I have to ask why. That is an interesting opinion. I think that is unshared by a lot of people, and I've never considered the prospect of uncommercialized sports. Maybe that's just because the environment in which I grew up. I mean, that's all we've ever known: the NFL, the football players, and the MLB, the baseball players, and making huge contracts. But based on the fact that they're drawing a lot of eyeballs, people want to see them, and they want to see great skill on the field or on the pitch. And in order to attract the best players, one would think that they have to be compensated for their efforts. So why would you distinguish sports from any other sort of business enterprise?
Because it awakes nationalism, because it awakes bad emotions, because it proposes some of the rules and some of the organizations of competitions which are rather colonial and racist, and because so much money is spent on that. That's simply disgusting when you hear about 200 million paid for a guy who has to take care of his legs most of the time and nothing else. I mean, it's shameful.
Mhm.
There are some players, of course, which give away money, and they are to be respected. But the whole thing is about money and the guys, old guys who are behind the whole game. So I really don't like that.
Huh.
I like the excitement. I think the women screaming at the games and so on. It's fun. But this fun can be produced and can be reproduced without this kind of money, and without immorality, and without all the nationalism and hooligans and everything else which is related to sports today.
So
And the
you,
competition,
so,
unfortunately, is based on something. I mean, just listen to the sportsmen speaking. They're
yeah.
horrible. I
So
did it 100%.
so would you
Yeah.
support a return to the amateur qualification, right? Because amateur, it has its etymological roots in the word amator, amor, to love, and these were considered sportsmen who pursued their activity at which they had some expertise for the mere love of it, and they weren't expecting to bring home a hefty salary because of it. So would that be your preference? Maybe, I mean, it still doesn't address the problem of the nationalism, but would you prefer it that sportsmen, because there always will, I think, be sportsmen, just as there always have been, going back into classical times and perhaps even earlier. But would you prefer that style where it's maybe not compensated, or at least compensated to a far lesser extent, or maybe in a different way? Maybe they received their laurels, their laurel wreaths, and they just as the Greeks did, didn't they receive sort of like grain, or some sort of reward for the span of a year or something like that? Would you prefer that sort of a model?
No, this is not a real model. When they came back, I mean, the ancient athletes, the ancient Greek athletes, they would get a ton of privileges and money and monuments and everything you want when they came back. So it's not so naive and clean as it seems, not at all. Yes, laurel for the Olympics, but when you go home, you get everything else. So this is not the idea. My idea is that the state should finance sports, massive sports for everybody, uh, everywhere where it's possible, competition too, and also for the sportsmen who have to train for a long time, a certain kind of salary for that. So the teams should be composed on different criteria. Now they are international, but they play for a certain for the certain team or for the certain city or for the certain nation, of course. But the whole thing would be about making sports massive, making available, and making payable for those who are really talented. And you get talented people only by having a certain social and education without faith. That's the only way to get balance. That's the only way to really pick up those who will produce something sensational, and then let them do it. Pay their lives if they want to do it, and do not forget that most of the sportsmen just fade away after 35. For heaven's sake, what to do with them afterwards? The state should really care about these guys to give them another chance, to give them another profession, but not 200 million for transferring to a different club. So sports really is a really dirty space, a dirty cutthroat culture, if I would like to see completely.
Huh, yeah, of which America is probably the chief exporter of that type of culture. Are you and I've never considered it in so critical a way. So this is really enlightening to hear you explain it and very soundly. Would you say that you're more distressed by or uncomfortable with the profit motive, or the nationalistic sort of impulse that's created because of this?
Both equally.
Okay. All right, and of course we combine the two. Now, the one thing, the one thing that I find morally dubious at the very least is the imposition on cities and countries to fund the Olympic Games every 4 years or so, to take on massive amounts of debt, basically, for which the citizenry is going to be paying for many, many years to come, to enable them to create these beautiful, architecturally complex stadiums, and all these, hippodromes and all these mountains made of artificial snow, and for the use of a couple of weeks or maybe a month or two, and then what? They basically collapse into ruin, and they're never used again. You see this in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where years ago they hosted the Olympics, and then, of course, it is a financial boon to a certain extent while the events are going on, but then they're left with this crippling debt that has to be serviced somehow, and a bunch of people who really can't make use of these things in the middle of a favela somewhere, where the people are scraping to get by and not really getting by. So I definitely acknowledge that as a problem, as an issue. But I do think there's something kind of like inborn in the human spirit that seeks competition and wants to engage in these athletic performances. And yeah, I don't know how that can be uncoupled with the current incentive structure, where if you really want the best talent, colleges and universities in America, this is a unique problem. Public universities are doling out thousands of dollars to enable their to pay their coaching staffs, but then to enable their coaching staffs to recruit the best players. And of course, there's always a little bit of morally, again, dubious behavior going on when the coaches are trying to incentivize these young 17 and 18-year-old men who might come from downtrodden economic circumstances to come into their university and play for them for a certain amount of years before going on to even greater riches in the professional league. So yeah, there are some issues there, but I just don't know if we would see the best talent on the pitch or on the field. Well, given that, what is your favorite sport? I have to ask.
Well, swimming, of course, I like swimming.
Mm-hmm.
I liked swimming when I was able to do that, and I like basket.
Okay, very good. So to bring back the sensitive ticklish topic of transgenderism, and maybe this will be my last comment on it, and then I'll let you have your piece. But taking swimming as an example, in America and probably across the world, we had the story of the University of Pennsylvania swimmer, a biological male who I don't think has yet undergone any sort of surgical intervention to remove from him his virile parts, to put it mildly. Engaged in competition in the women's field and was quite successful, perhaps not surprisingly. So as someone who thinks that in the future this will be sort of much more normal, what do you think about that now? Because it seems to be an imperfect system where we're allowing at least one biological male to compete in a field of women and to succeed and to be applauded for having done so. Perhaps maybe a third category of transgender individuals could compete, on their own. What do you think?
Remember the East German athletes who were of really dubious sex because of political reasons and so on. But I would remind you something. What is the meaning of sport and of physical readiness? There is one film that really took somehow the idea of Athenian democracy and what is necessary for a citizen, and that is waterboard. You remember that book? In that book, the little girl is taught to swim, to write, and to speak. So again, she speaks the epic story of her hero. So these are the three things that the Athenian citizens had to know. He had to swim because he had to serve as a sailor. He had to draw to know geometrics, to measure up things. And the third, he had to speak. He had to know grammar, rhetorics, and he had to have style if he wanted to succeed. So these three elements are the elements of a citizen. And the little girl in that film really is the model of Athenian democracy. That's why I really love that film, because it's weirdly, out of nothing, came out with this model, which is obvious for the direct democracy. So yes, this combination of physical capacity, literacy, grammar, and style would be ideal for a modern citizen. And I don't see it in completely utopian dimensions at all.
Yeah, no, and that doesn't sound like it's asking for too much of our governmental institutions to be able to raise the citizenry on those three pillars. And again, I think we've gotten far away from that and have forgotten those lessons that our Athenian democratic forebears have imparted to us through the ages. So I spoke briefly about the inborn sort of desire to be competitive. I want to shift to another something that is inborn, and that's specific to Americans, and that is our constitutional right to speak freely. And that's, of course, a right around which our First Amendment to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights erects a strong and inviolable wall. Now, it's not only that we have the right to free speech in America, but that Congress can enact no law that will even abridge it. So it's, I think, a very significant distinction to make and to be aware of. But as someone who grew up in a country in a time that didn't especially value freedom of speech, and maybe when speech was decidedly unfree, how do you understand the concept of freedom of speech? And would you consider it the most important of all human rights?
No, I wouldn't say that was the most important value of the human right, the human rights. No, not at all. But I was living in a country in which freedom of speech had to be conquered. And in the 70s, especially in 80s, after the President Tito died, this space of freedom has been opened. And in the 80s, I was even the director of the Serbian Writers Union Committee for the Freedom of Expression. And I was writing petitions and going into polemics and so on, depending on the possibilities. And our idea of freedom of speech, of course, was based on intelligent speech. So to put it, criticism of the regime, but powerful criticism of the regime with arguments, with all the possibilities that academics can have, and so on and so on. So it was a fight for the intelligent speech. Then I came to the States in 1993, and my colleagues in the States taught me a lesson, which was extremely important, that it is, of course, it is important what is said, what is the countenance of the freedom of the speech. But on the other hand, there are things that are supposed not to be said. And that freedom of speech also comprises things that have not to be said or must not be said, because they cause turbulence and human suffering. So I learned my lesson. I came back and I acted in a country in Slovenia in which freedom of expression today is extremely important. In fact, it's a main political question today in Slovenia, because the right wing and the neo-fascists, which are present in Slovenia, especially the sturdy right wing type of Orban, the president of Hungary, is the ideal. So you understand the situation. This right wing introduced 7 years ago a number of media which were financed first by Hungary and then by some other sources, not always transparent, in which blaming people for race, gender, religion, ethnic origin, so on, is a common thing. It's a dirty speech, it's a cloaca speech, really, and cloaca maxima in many ways. And this is concerned freedom of speech. It's not freedom of speech. The freedom of speech, in fact, to be free, has to be limited. It's a paradox, but it does concern the today's situation in which even people which are of high places in the world allow themselves to say horrible things about others, about everybody. They are ready to really demean everything that they take into their mouth. So freedom of speech is a completely different problem from the time that I was engaged and punished basically for defending the freedom of speech. So what we have to do is thinking about education, literacy, and the education of the Athenian citizen, the simple one, which would lead us to the situation in which nobody would feel urged to use horrible language, dirty language, attacks, and so on and so on. So that's what I think about freedom of speech today.
Yeah, and that's a sentiment I think with which a lot of people would agree. Yeah, I've always find it interesting to speak with someone such as yourself who kind of stands astride two worlds, or has stood astride two worlds, where, as you noted, the concepts of that fundamental right are very different. Right, the European model of, or an understanding of free speech or speech is quite different. And take England for example. There's no written constitution where such a right is protected, and it's not understood in the same way. Whereas in America, it's a cherished right, on which a lot of people are reliant for their livelihoods, be it commentators or writers or what have you. Do you think that in any way it stifles the creative output of a people or of a nation to have these maybe soft or not so soft limitations on what they can or can't say, even if it is egregious or uncouth?
But one thing is the American model of free speech as it's written in the Constitution, which is absolutely the model that everybody follows. But on the other hand, you have today's situation, and not only in the United States, but everywhere, that's saying a lie doesn't bring any punishment. That it doesn't matter at all what you speak of. People allow themselves to speak unbelievable things, which are not true, which are lies, which are defamation, which are simply dirty language, and nobody cares. Nobody punishes these people, even if they're presidents of the states and so on and so on. So that's a problem, really. I would really be for if you want renovation, a new European reading of the American Constitution. That would help a lot. But on the other hand, the situation is not better. It's not even worse in the United States, but where we come to this lotteria, which really threatens to kill us all, because it's about violence. These words produce violence. There's no doubt at all. And again, one of my great changes in life in the 70s, 80s, I was a great European believer in the separation of the author and his work. But quite other theories, the author is not responsible for his work, there's a believer which introduces his own bit, and so on and so on. And we were very happy with it, because we could use this argument in Yugoslavia at the trials of people who were tried for saying or writing something. Say to a judge, the author cannot be responsible for his text. It sounded perfect. Some judges even accepted that new theory. But now we are in a different way.
Was there a specific example of that happening?
Oh, many of them, yeah.
Is there one that's especially resonant to you? Do you remember one vividly?
Oh, of course, I remember at least 3 trials in Belgrade in which poets were accused of saying something which was understood as, wrongfully directed against the regime. Okay, so we come to the court, and the lawyer says, but the author is not responsible for his work. Look at Umberto Eco's theory, and so on and so on. And we had great fun in doing so, because it was already, the situation was such that you could write publicly about it. And most of these trials after people's death just crumbled. They didn't finish because people could not believe anymore that anybody could offend the regime with some words or with poetry, whatever. So The situation changed in nationalism, and in the days after before, during, and after the Yugoslav war, where words when words really meant something. It says that words were leading young men to the fronts to kill their co-citizens and so on. So yes, the words became heroes at a certain stage, but simple words.
I've always been perplexed by the history of Yugoslavia, and I think I could be pardoned as as an American. It's not very thoroughly detailed in our curricula as you come up through high school and in university, unless you pursue like a Balkan specific course of study. So it seems to be that in the Balkans there's a heightened sensitivity about nationalism, and I think we understand just the way we maybe understand the freedom of speech a little bit differently in America. I think we understand nationalism differently in America, being that we're such a large continental nation with so many regional idiosyncrasies and characteristics, that it's hard for us to conceptualize this area that has gone through in Eastern Europe, that has gone through so many upheavals and changes, and has experienced the drawing of new borders and new lines, and so many ethnic groups and religious groups, as you mentioned earlier, kind of being at once in close proximity and perhaps with animosity toward one another. So how should the unschooled American understand maybe the modern short history of the Balkans and how that influences your understanding of nationalism?
With difficulties, I must say. I met many Americans with really open minds who had problems understanding it. The whole thing is about the nationalism, which was invented in the Balkans in the 19th century, not before, and that in the second, but the 19th century. So it's pure invention. Balkans before, of course, have a multitude of ethnic groups, multitude of languages. It's almost like like the Indian Peninsula. It's hundreds of languages, hundreds of dialects, hundreds of ethnic groups, which sometimes are professionally determined, and so on and so on. So, and in the Balkans, you cannot survive. You could not survive if you didn't know several languages. That's the Balkans, and also good part of so-called Central Europe. So in this situation, forming nations, forming states, the whole thing about the nation and the states is the political fight for territory, for the state, for the new position in Europe, and so on and so on. So taking away this narrative of the community, of the national community, is coming down to, in fact, with the example which is very dear to me because I lived through it, and that is the Yugoslav dissidents, which was against the regime, and where I was living for 30 years or more, wanted the freedom of expression and the respect of human rights. These were the political problems. Of course, we were thinking about the multi-party system and so on, but that was technicality after once we achieved this. And then, after the death of Tito, a new narrative appeared, and most of the dissidents went into a different concept in which the collective, the history, and the nation were the most important. So individual rights, human rights, everything is lost. Only the collective is important. And in the collective, of course, you can work on your own political career, you can work or you can use narratives to pull people, to make propaganda, and so on and so on. So the whole thing is a product of the politics of the 19th century, late 19th century, in which Balkan and Central European states were fighting for independence and taking models of great nation states like France, Great Britain, and so on and so on, in forming their own structure. And this structure had a problem with national, because national was the only narrative that was available. So the ancient myths were changed to serve national myths. The literature, oral literature especially, was changed in meaning to serve national goals. The whole revolution happened, and unfortunately, it was not well recorded by historians. That's a real problem, because we in the Balkans, in the school system, we were learning about the whole world. I remember lessons about Indonesia. I remember the lessons about the American War for Independence. I remember the history of Canada from my high school years. This is not the case in Western Europe or in the United States. People do not learn globally because this is considered to be privilege and punishment of small nations. And the whole concept of small nations, which are not known, nobody knows. You remember English politicians in 1939, they were speaking of Czechoslovakia as a country far away. For heaven's sake, it's 1 hour flight. Okay, it was maybe 3 hours flight then. But the whole thing is about cultural colonialism, which is rooted deeply into the so-called Western civilization. I don't know exactly what Western civilization is. I can't find so many parallels between the French, Italian, Spanish, Greek, especially Greek, Turkish construct of narratives. They're so close, so similar, so parallel. So nationalism and the political fight for, let's say, power in a small state, that's the reason why we don't understand Balkans. Otherwise, Balkans is perfectly clear with its multilingualism, multiculturalism, its cooperation between small nations to survive. And I repeat once more, the ideal nation became familiar in the Balkans only in the second half of the 19th century.
And do you think? And do you think that this cultural colonialism of which you speak, is that a natural outgrowth of nationalism? Because it sounds like, maybe in some ways those terms conflict in some ways. I think cultural colonialism, I think imperialism, and that sounds like to be like it's almost the opposite to nationalism, or perhaps the cultural colonialism or the economic colonialism is, I think, as maybe some Marxists would argue, maybe the highest form of capitalism. So how do you understand those two terms and their relationship to one another?
Basically, they are interchangeable. Let's face it. European countries have had the colonies in outside world, the West Indies and other imaginary territories, which they name after their imaginary utopian ideas about the world. And when you think about how easily the colonial mind is naming concepts and things, I will give just one example. When the import from the Americas became expensive and highly risky because of the wars and of the pirates and so on, Europe has found a new way to get the colonial goods, and that was via Turkey. And the cheaper way was to travel through the Balkans, so by land, not by the sea. So the whole thing suddenly changes at a certain moment, basically in 16th century and then in the 17th century. And suddenly you have the cases like, what is the name of a bird which comes from the Americas to Europe and is eaten for American festivities? Well, it's Turkey. It's a Turkish bird, for heaven's sake. There is a complete confusion.
Not a very flavorful one, I will add.
So nobody cares about the real origin, the real history, about the real maps, if you want. Everybody cares about getting stuff, paying for stuff as little as possible, and then using it. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the name is, because you can use any name. Tendency is the same. getting something for someone who is miserable enough to sell it. It's the same spirit of colonialism, which now goes into completely different direction.
As someone who reveres the culture of classical Athens, wouldn't you want that culture exported to the rest of the world? In other words, do you not perceive some of the benefits that are concomitant with these cultural artifacts being moved about the world? I mean, I don't mean to say imposed by force necessarily, but like, wouldn't you want a small boy in China, let's say, to be able to pick up, Sophocles's Oedipal trilogy and read that and be enriched by it? Or would you not want, the Lysistrata to fall into the hands of a young girl in Botswana, who can then, take this relic of Western culture and hopefully improve herself and to edify herself? That's how I, maybe in my too Pollyanna-ish or optimistic view, that's how I see what you describe as cultural colonialism. What I hope it's not, and in often cases it turns into this, is sort of the baser, meaner, totally, commercialized exportation from America to other countries of certain habits of mind that maybe aren't so edifying. But at its best, I think the cultural colonial project is that those young children being able to immerse themselves in great works of literature, of which the Western mind, let's say, is the parent. So how do you think about that?
But of course, that's not cultural colonialism. That's a legacy. That's cultural legacy. And cultural legacy of ancient Greece is equally important in China and Botswana as in let's say, Macedonia or anywhere else. So this cultural legacy should be spread. And unfortunately, we also deal with the cultural colonial in the cultural legacy, in the sense that many, let's say, specialists in Great Britain or in Germany or in France think that people from Central and Eastern Europe or China should not be specialists in ancient studies. And ancient studies are so international, they are so important for every culture on this planet, that this is an idiotic idea. But I witnessed that in the debate let's say, a couple of years ago, when many classicists appeared as horrible conservatives in the case of the name of Macedonia. So they were completely unable to hide their self-esteem, their idea that they are the only who can deal with ancient studies and ancient cultures. And very often, I can tell you, they also deny Greeks the possibility of understanding their own early past. So we have a problem. We have a real problem. Cultural colonialism inside cultural legacy. And of course, the cultural legacy of ancient Greece is global, and it is global because it's translated into Chinese, many Chinese dialects. It is performed on Chinese stages. I remember a very good Chinese media in Athens some 30 years ago, but it was excellent. It was very original. It was greatly done. So, yes, ancient Greece and the qualities of ancient Greek culture, which are based on certain forms of democracy and even on some form of much lesser democracy, which is Roman Republican arrangement. Yes, these are the things which have to be global. They are the cultural legacy of the world. And there should be no difference between a philologist from Baku and a philologist from
Yeah.
There is.
Sure. You mentioned the pursuit of the classics by, let's say, an Asian scholar, for instance. I'm reminded of some of the great classical pianists and violinists and musical performers are
Of course.
Asian overwhelmingly in the West, and I think that's a great thing. I think it's a marvelous thing, and again, I think that it is the talent and the skill that are employed at very young ages to be able to cultivate, an ability to play the sonatas of Beethoven or the symphonies of Mozart. That is so wonderful. But it is a legacy from a very specific culture. I grant that it is universalized and universalizable, but it had to come from somewhere, and I don't think that um, should be overlooked as we acknowledge the greatness that is disseminated on the world because of those origins. So, how maybe you could give us, an example of.
Mhm.
Well, no, I'll avoid that. I was going to ask you maybe to give us an example of cultural colonialism um, working in a deleterious way, in a way that might not be so salutary. But I think I basically outlined that in talking about some of our exports to the rest of the world. Maybe I could ask you this, and just briefly, when we were talking about the freedom of speech, I regarded it as, if not the fundamental human right, maybe one of them. But you indicated that you don't think it is the most important human right. What would you say is the most important human right?
To life, to life.
Sure, sure. And maybe you
And
can enlarge on that a little bit.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Which also goes to extremities, to the really dangerous extremities. But let's say the penal, death penalty, which is the law today in the European community, and nobody can enter European community with this death penalty in their laws. So this is extremely important. But on the other hand, it's also freedom of women to decide about their bodies. It's the same. Right. Today in Slovenia, we have a horrible course of limited discussion about euthanasia. So, so the people who are for the death penalty and against the abortion are against euthanasia, and they're against. Well, we have two different ways of thinking globally, and one is how to diminish, how to shorten, how to destroy human rights, and the other is how to enlarge human rights, because the list is not complete. There are many items on the list which really have to be brought in, like the right of settlement, the right of the right of the right of energy, because for the is a sign of purity of many against that. So there are many rights we should include and think about it, not to diminish or to shorten this.
Mhm. And are you encouraged by the way in which, or the direction in which, the Western world is moving in the protection of these rights, or are you discouraged by what you see?
At this moment, I'm really discouraged because many countries do show that intentions which are in favor of that penalty, physical punishment, torture, imprisonment, and other actions against human rights, which are. Well, I'm not very optimistic about that.
I see. I see. So you've been extraordinarily generous with your time, and I know we've run into a few interruptions, technological interruptions, of which our viewers and listeners will have only a small amount of awareness as they watch this. And
Sorry.
with the magic of iMovie and some editing tricks, they'll see a seamless transition from the point at which we cut out and the point at which we find ourselves at this very moment. I told you prior to our recorded conversation that I could speak with you for many hours, many days, and just absorb the wisdom that you have to offer. And I still hold to that. I feel like I've only scratched the very surface of your intellect, which might be which might be which might be unfathomable. Um, so I thank you for that. Maybe we can leave our listeners and viewers with this, and that is a piece of wisdom that you derived from your studies of antiquity. One piece of wisdom that can be imparted to the current present hour. You've lived a long life. You've seen a great deal of upheaval, of change, and you have this knowledge of antiquity, which educates one in the fact that things are constantly changing. So maybe by that metric, things really don't change all that much at all. But there must be some permanent, eternal truth that you learned from the past that might be applicable to in this current day. So we'll end on that. What would be that piece of wisdom with which we can improve ourselves in the current hour?
Well, we don't compromise with what we have learned. Don't make compromise. And the other would be that democracy is fragile, but it's fragile because it has to be changed all the time. So, in fact, it's so stable. And I wonder why it's not applicable to direct democracy, because it's stable in changing.
I see. So it's the fragility of democracy and the uncompromising ways of your grandmother and your father.
Yeah, in many ways, yeah.
The employment of their hard-headedness. Well, Svetlana, again, I can't express to you enough my gratitude for your having joined me. I know it was difficult circumstances and we're thousands of miles apart in many hours. And again, you've been very generous with your time. I'll be sure to link to any possible writings that might be available from you. I know that you and a prior guest of mine, to whom I'm also very grateful, Noah Charney, are currently working on a forthcoming book called Slavic Myths, or detailing Slavic myths, to which I'm really looking forward. I almost wanted to talk about that now, but I'll have to invite you back on and we'll dedicate an entire episode to that, because again, just I have no knowledge of a Slavic myth, so I'm very eager to learn about them. So I'll be sure to link to that once it's published. But are there any final parting words that you'd like to give us?
I have fun, and I have had the feeling that some things were said by both of us, which clarify some mysterious aspects of global understanding approaches. Ancient culture in a slightly different light, and Balkans in a slightly, for example, Europe in a slightly different light. So that's quite enough for a conversation, I think.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. And you said that perfectly and eloquently. So with that, I will bid everyone farewell. I am again your faithful friend and host, Daniel Finneran, bidding you adieu from Finneran's Wake.